Welcome to the Open Loop podcast. It's a podcast exploring the people, companies, and ideas shaping the future of neurotechnology. I'm Chay Carter, the founder of Carter Sciences, Recce Neuro, and the Neurotech newsletter. In each episode, I sit down with founders, operators, researchers, investors, and leaders building the edge of neuroscience, neurotechnology, and healthcare. We'll have honest conversations about people's journeys into the neurotech industry, what they're currently building, how it's going, the realities, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and what the future holds for the neurotech industry in general. Hello, we are joined today by George Harston from Brainomix, the Chief Medical and Innovation Officer. George, great to have you on.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.
Well, I'd love to start off by telling the audience what Brainomix is all about and a little bit about your journey to your current position.
Sure. So Brainomix, we're an AI imaging software company. We make medical device software as a medical device in stroke and also in fibrosing lung disease. And our technologies, regardless of the indication, support the interpretation of scans, medical scans, to inform treatment decisions for patients, to improve the number of patients who are being treated and also the type of patients and what treatment they're getting. In terms of our business, we work globally in our biggest footprint in Europe, growing quite quickly in the US, and we deploy software into hospitals. And so we fully integrate into the hospital imaging systems, process the scans, and output the results in near real time. We also support life science partners, so pharmaceutical companies and device companies with the design and delivery of clinical trials, and also sort of a digital go-to-market type activity, supporting the sort of phase 4 activity for new drugs and devices.
Fantastic. So are you sort of pre-surgical procedure working with clinicians and surgeons and working with patients too at the same time?
Yes, I guess so. Not just surgery, also sort of medical interventions, pharmaceutical interventions as well, but absolutely. So scans don't really help patients unless they're linked to a diagnosis or a treatment decision. And that's the bit that we try to unlock. So there's a real wealth of data in scans these days, but actually the challenge is getting the sort of meaningful information out of that data in the scans and helping it drive a treatment decision in an effective way. So for example, with stroke, we know that patients are massively undertreated worldwide, and when they are treated, there's delays to the identification of patients who might benefit from treatments. And those treatments may be around giving drugs to try and break down a blockage to a blood vessel supplying the brain. It might be doing a minimally invasive surgical procedure, something called mechanical thrombectomy, to open up a blood vessel and restore blood to the brain. But actually, every minute you delay, you lose an opportunity to recover. So every minute, on average, for these large strokes, you lose about 2 million neurons. So it's a big hit if you don't identify these patients at all. And even if you do identify them, you don't identify them in a timely manner. And that's really where we come in, supporting the identification of these patients. Similarly, but on a different timescale in lung disease, we know a lot of patients with fibrosing lung disease miss out on the opportunity for antifibrotic therapies. These are a range of drugs now which can help slow the progression of this really very debilitating condition where patients get progressively breathless and ultimately die over years. We support the early identification of these patients so that they can get these antifibrotic treatments earlier and have a longer and better quality life.
Interesting. I mean, your background is obviously heavily stroke-centric, stroke physician at Oxford and researcher and company executive all at the same time. I mean, I would love to know more about your career and what got you into the stroke space initially at Oxford.
Yeah, so I was, you're quite right. So I trained as a physician originally and did my medical training in the UK in Cambridge and sort of worked my way up through the system. But then back in 2008, 2009, got an academic post in Oxford and came here to complete a sort of parallel academic clinical track program. I did some basic science stroke research, but then really got into imaging and did my PhD in acute stroke imaging, looking at how the information we can get out of scans can tell us more about what's happening to patients' brains when they're having a stroke. And then after my PhD, I was very interested in thinking about how we take those findings with MRI scans, advanced imaging, and translate them back into more sort of readily accessible imaging modalities. So CT scans, which, are very easy to do, but less granular, less rich in terms of information. So I worked on that for a few years while completing my clinical training. And then when I finished all of that in 2018, an opportunity came up to come in and join the team at Brainomix, as we were really growing really quite fast at the time, and trying to drive the adoption of our technology to support better treatment decisions. And so joined Brainomix then as Chief Medical and Innovation Officer, and over the years grown the activity really to think about how we generate evidence around our products. So how do we demonstrate the performance, but also more importantly, demonstrate the value, the impact they can have to patients, patient pathways. And then I also now oversee our product management function. So thinking about how we frame our product offering so that it's as clinically relevant as possible and really sort of addressing the unmet needs in healthcare systems. And excitingly, in parallel, we've grown our what we call our life science business unit. So alongside our sort of software as a service model where we deploy our technology in hospitals, we also work with pharma partners, because there's a real synergy, and device companies, but there's a real synergy in the treatment space with what we do. When our technology goes in, more patients get identified more effectively and more patients get treatment. It's clearly good for the patients. It's clearly good for hospitals. It's good for us, but actually it's also of significant value to these drug companies. And so we really try to support them to make sure that as many patients benefit from their treatments as possible. So we work a lot in partnership at Brainomix, but it's not just with academic institutions. It's not just with hospitals. It's also with other key players in the space in terms of trying to improve the outcomes that patients ultimately have.
There's a lot of applications, aren't there, I think, for advanced imaging in this space. And I feel like the integration of AI and the acceleration of certain softwares are really, really improving the options for hospital settings and patients alike. And there's a few different companies popping up doing a few different things. I mean, how much of an AI element is there to your software and and how does it impact the speed, I suppose, of what you're trying to build?
Yeah, so AI is really core to what we do. So we have a variety of different AI algorithms that sit within our product. Um, Critically, AI is just a part of it. Yes, it's a central part, but actually it's pretty meaningless if it doesn't integrate into a patient pathway or a workflow to add value. So although we spend a lot of time optimizing our algorithms, improving the performance of the technology, the bigger value is actually in how it impacts and how it gets used. A very high performing system with an excellent area under the receiver operating characteristic curve might win a lot of prizes in a conference abstract, but actually, unless you can integrate into a pathway, make clinicians understand what it's outputting, give them the confidence to act on the results they're seeing, to make sure that it's seamless, it's timely, it happens in real, it happens where they need it, then none of it can have an impact. So we spend at least as much, if not more time, thinking about how we optimize the adoption of our technology, not just how well the technology performs.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of companies at the moment. We're in the AI era, aren't we? Where it feels a little bit bubbly at times, where a lot of companies are putting .ai after their company name on a website, and all of a sudden we feel like maybe the valuation has increased by a certain amount, but whether or not it actually adds value. So it's interesting to hear you talk about it as the core technology is something else, but it obviously adds tremendous value.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think AI has become a bit of a marketing term rather than being anything particularly meaningful. I think you need the right tool for the right job. We definitely use AI methodologies, but I think that's probably, only, as I said, only a part of where we add value is through the AI.
Yeah. So the company was an Oxford spinout, right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, so you've seen Oxford spin out to NHS and out of a recent Series C and a US launch. I mean, how's that journey been? That's quite spectacular to see, and pretty quite inspirational for a lot of people right now who are pretty doing some research.
Yeah, we've been very fortunate at Brainomix to have had a lot of success, a lot of traction, and I have a particular viewpoint on it, which is that it's all about clinical adoption and clinical impact, which is all driven by evidence. And as an Oxford University spin out, there's still a very academic culture, an evidence-based culture to the company, and I think that stood us in good stead. Over the years, we've seen different trends or people getting excited about different technologies or spins or angles on technology, but actually, if you keep focusing on adding value to the patient pathway, you can't go too far wrong. So if you add value to a patient population, because ultimately all healthcare systems derive their value from making people better. However efficient or inefficient they are, that generally is how they end up. And so provided we focus on that and then just adjust our narrative, the way we frame things, depending on which healthcare system you're working with, that's really where we've seen the traction.
Was there a specific moment in the development of this technology, or maybe, as you were getting it into hospital settings, or even just through research, where you thought, okay, we're actually onto something really special here, and this is going to make a big impact on people's lives? Was it like one specific case or a specific patient?
Yeah, for me, it was actually shortly after I joined Brainomix. I went to a conference in France and was talking to some very high-profile physicians, very impressive people who'd been leading the field for many years. And I showed them this case that I'd been looking at. And, I showed them without the technology and said, what's your assessment? And then I said, okay, now here we go. Let's turn on the technology. What do you think of this? And I remember several of them being like, hang on a second. Yeah, no, that's right. I'd missed that. And actually that for me was, I realized in a sort of qualitative manner that actually this was doing something, adding value to all physicians. So you think if you can add value to those people who are real experts leading the field, most patients don't get to ever meet somebody as specialist as that. You see your front door physician in whatever hospital's closest to you. So the value you can add to them is massive. And I think that for me qualitatively was when I thought, actually this is really helpful, really valuable. And then quantitatively, it's when you talk to people who are using it and say, actually, this is what we measured our performance without our technology, and then put the Brainomix technology in, and this is then what we did. And we built on that over the years. So first you get individual hospitals, and there's some great collaborators in Europe, Italy, Hungary, who've shown that sort of single hospital experience. And then we've used that to build and do these sort of network-wide studies. And that then has been conclusive for me. If you can show generalizable impact across networks of hospitals, in all shapes and sizes and colors, then that was really where I thought, actually, this is something that can be really impactful. But critically, it's not just about, you can't just do that and then expect it to have the impact everywhere. One of the things we spend a lot of time thinking about is how we support people to extract the value from our technology. So it's not enough just to put it in. You've got to innovate, you've got to disrupt, you've got to do something with it in order to have an impact. If it just sits there and runs, it's not going to do anything. It's one of the interesting differences, with medtech and pharma. So with pharma, once you've got the drug in, by and large, it'll have whatever effect it should or shouldn't do. With medtech, once you've got it in, that's not enough. You then have to do stuff to work at it. And it may be that different healthcare systems respond or extract different value from a technology. So some people, for us, it's, they really value the detection of vessel occlusions. For other people, it's the quantification of disease injury. For other people, it's, something simple as communication or image sharing. And so there's different value which may differentially add to different healthcare systems.
Is that based on what the patient needs, or what the individual hospital setting has found useful, or maybe they notice a gap in their own ability to detect these things?
Yeah, so in stroke particularly, the patient involvement is much more passive, I guess, because if you're having your stroke in a time-critical situation, as a stroke physician, it's very hard to engage patients in decisions about their treatment. You try as much as you can within the time constraints, but ultimately you don't want to deny someone a treatment just because you're trying to get them to understand in all its sort of full detail. So actually, often it's the healthcare system that we have to work more closely with than the patients. That's not to say that patients aren't central to what we do, but the healthcare system is in the business of trying to improve the patient outcomes. And so we work indirectly, I guess, with the patients, predominantly in terms of impact through the healthcare systems, so that we've got this population of patients. This is where we're seeing a challenge. This is the unmet need. And then we sort of work together to support that value add. That said, we've had some very meaningful engagements with patients over the years who provided a lot of input about, how we're doing what we're doing and informing our technology. But in terms of having an impact, certainly in stroke, the patient is less directly involved in that decision making.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I suppose it's about acting quickly, isn't it, really, in those situations? I mean, that's really, really impressive data from you guys, I think, coming out at the moment. I mean, what was the situation like technologically prior to the Brainomix, the imaging technology being readily available? How has this changed the decision-making process?
Yeah, so I mean, if I think back to when I was a trainee, and I remember doing a stroke job in a general hospital in the region in around Oxford, and I did I was overnight managing the take, and I was stroke interested, and a patient comes in, and this chap clearly had a stroke, and I remember trying to get, first of all, you have to wait for a diagnosis or a report of the scan from somebody who's not a specialist and isn't confident themselves anyway out of hours. And then I was trying to communicate with the hospital in London at the time, because this was on the border of the region, and they were the only people providing this service, this intervention this guy needed. And I remember having to get my phone and WhatsApp them and video and show them it was just it was a joke. And so not only was there a risk of him being missed, but there's also a risk of there's a whole load of data governance issues, and then there's also the time delay that all this sort of puts in place. So it was really disjointed, and it was poorly done, with a lot of disparity in provision of care. One of the things we noticed when we put the technology in, we did a large evaluation. It was published last year in Lancet Digital Health, and we put our technology in across 26 hospitals in England, and we looked at the performance over several years of these hospitals as we put the technology in. And we saw an impact. So more patients got treated, and they got treated quicker. And both of those things are important to improve outcomes. If you're not treated, you're not going to get a good outcome. And if you're treated too late, you're not going to get a good outcome. And what we saw was the biggest impact was in the less specialist hospitals. So that's critical about understanding your unmet need. We have to work with, and we want to work with, specialist centres, because they will be the sort of thought leaders in the space and will drive the adoption of new technologies. But actually, you have to create your product so that it can still add value to where the biggest unmet need is. 80% or so of patients don't go to a specialist centre first off. A subset will hopefully be transferred to a specialist centre, but most patients don't go to a specialist centre. They don't go during daytime hours, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. And so you have to be able to provide a technology that can be used in that out of hours, non-specialist centre with whatever imaging modalities they have available. So for stroke, that's a plain CT head scan and a CT angiogram. Now, you can have a technology that supports MRI analysis and CT perfusion, what have you, but actually that's not going to address your biggest unmet need. It's important, but it's not going to really move the needle in terms of patient outcomes.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? I think you guys are expanding as well, aren't you, outside of stroke into is it e-lung? Tell us a bit about that.
That's right. So this was several years ago, about 6 years ago now. We looked at through part of our expansion and growth. We looked to identify an area where there was a similar unmet need, where imaging, patients are missing out on treatment in an efficient manner, and where imaging could help support improving their care. And actually, we alighted on fibrosing lung disease. The reason being is this is very different to stroke. It's a much slower time course. So generally, patients sort of will go from diagnosis, and actually, once you're diagnosed, people live perhaps 3-5 years, and their lungs become progressively scarred, and ultimately, patients sadly die from this condition. But it's hard to diagnose. It's hard to diagnose early, because one of the key characteristics is you need to have progressive fibrosis. So your lungs need to be scarring, and they're scarring up over time, sort of increasingly. And the challenge you have is that in the before you could use this sort of technology, you had to rely on a test where you blow into a machine and see how hard you could blow the air into this machine, something called lung function tests. And they're very noisy. They're very variable. It depends how big the effort is. If you have a cold, it will be worse. If you'd had a cigarette, it'd be worse. Sure. Time of day, all this sort of noise. So trying to reliably measure whether someone's got worse or not is difficult. And then so you can look at the scans. But if you look at the scans as a radiologist, it's really hard to quantify the extent of disease and to be confident. Okay, to be able to say, yes, there's a clear change, it's progressed, you have to have quite a lot of change. And you also have to be a specialist to be able to do that. So what our technology does is we measure the amount of scarring on the lungs over time, and over serial scans over years often. And then when we detect a change, so we can then support the doctors in identifying those patients who have actually fibrotic disease and need this new treatment. what we've shown is that we did a study last year, which was presented and is under review as a paper at the moment. And it showed that, in over half of patients, about 2/3 of patients, we could have brought forward the time to diagnosis. And the amount we could bring it forward by was over a year on average. So, really clinically meaningful length of time in well over half the patients in a condition, where the life expectancy is often very limited. So really important unmet need there. And so really excited now to be working with some early adopting sites in the US and hopefully not too long in Europe, to show that actually prospectively we can see this impact as well as we have done in stroke. So same problem, just different time scale.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think describing you guys as a imaging AI, software company essentially is probably underplaying it. It's more like a clinical AI company. It's probably the reality of it.
That's definitely true. So there are some companies that do sort of radiology efficiency type imaging stuff, breast cancer screening, helping support mammography interpretation, important, clear value, but very different to what we do. For us, we work along the patient sort of horizontal around the sort of the treatment pathway rather than that sort of radiology vertical. Most of our champions are advocates, a lot of radiologists like what we do, but actually the real champions are the people who own the pathway. So in stroke, the stroke physicians, in lung, the chest physicians, the pulmonologists who really support the delivery of treatments for patients.
Yeah. And what's the US launch focused on? Is it on both products right now that you're looking at? And how's that going?
Yeah, it's going really well, actually. I mean, the US is it's a very different set of healthcare systems, and obviously a very different scale, but really important. And as a company, our investors are very keen that we get proof points in the US, rightly so. It's a massive healthcare market. But one of the things that's been really exciting, and I guess they're quite different, the stroke and the lung stuff. So in stroke, there are other people in the space in the US so the market is reasonably competitive. But what's been really nice is that I think we have a technology that over the years we've refined and developed in Europe, and we have very clinically meaningful impact data in contrast to some of the competition in the US. And so it's been really exciting to go to the US, put our technology into early adopting centers, and they see that actually it adds value, not just as a sort of way of looking at scans, but actually with clinically meaningful AI outputs that support the delivery of care. So we've had some really good success stories. We've been adding value in West Virginia University of Medicine, so really massive predominantly rural healthcare system, very impressive specialist centre, but 25 odd hospitals in the network. And so it's all those hospitals that refer in where there's this big unmet need. And so we're able to support, even in these small hospitals, the identification of patients who might benefit from treatment. And one of the things that we've been very pleased about is that they had previous technologies in the past that only addressed 6 of the hospitals in the network, 25, just because it had been hard to put in these technologies. But actually we really focused on it, and we've now covered the whole network. We're starting to see the impact, and really working closely with those physicians to make sure our product gives the best fit for their unmet need. And now we're continuing to work with them to innovate and adjust our technology. Similarly, in other healthcare systems, seeing that sort of early adopter sort of recognition of the value of our product in stroke. But in lung, it's a very different experience because there isn't the same widespread acceptance that you should use AI imaging technology for this condition. So a blank canvas presents a different set of challenges. People have to come to terms with the fact this is a useful technology generally, and then you have to implement it and showcase it. And but that's been really exciting. Everyone who touches it, when people go in, there's always a healthy degree of skepticism. But then once they start using it, we see that people actually, this is really helpful. And we were really pleased that some of our early adopting sites have just been sort of you can't turn it off. We've got to keep this going. We need this sort of clinically now. So yeah, it's been a really positive journey, but very different to Europe in many ways.
Yeah, I speak to a lot of people in Europe who go through that, and everyone has a different experience, right? I think there's the initial piece is, I think, underestimating the size and the scale of the US, and then obviously the state by state healthcare systems, and then the national healthcare systems as well. It can get pretty complicated pretty quickly, but I think there's a lot of success stories out there too. I mean, how different is it across the 2 different indications you're looking at, from stroke and to lung focus as well? Is that I mean, I appreciate, early adopters and the lung side is one thing, and then obviously more established stroke business. But is it, from a reimbursement perspective, very different, or how are you finding that side?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the straight pathway typically leads to patients being admitted to hospital. So there's a different structure for reimbursement as opposed to the lung work, which is predominantly outpatient. So there are different frameworks for things like reimbursement, which is critical in the US. Interestingly, the reimbursement piece is something that, we've been working on quite hard and, have a plan in both stroke and lung. But the when you come at it for the first time, it feels very alien as a concept, and you're, oh my goodness, this is something that we have no idea how to deal with this sort of crazy US healthcare system and the way it's funded. But actually, if you boil it down, or once you boil it down, you do realize that actually they're just looking for the same things. They are looking, these reimbursement frameworks are based on patient impact ultimately, and certainly if you want a sustainable CPT code, for example, it's clinical evidence that you need. There is still the patient that sits at the center of the value, and provided you focus on adding value to the patient, then I think you can do okay. But yeah, it is different. And then the other thing that's different is they're much more honest about money in the US than they are in other parts of the world. I mean, you talk to the NHS about money, and they look at you oddly. People don't have a concept. But the NHS runs entirely on money, obviously, very thin margins, and but all the clinicians have much less insight into that generally than in the US, where it's much more open and transparent. And there are pros and cons to that, obviously, but yeah, it is a different approach.
European healthcare systems are quite complex. Like you said, yeah, thin margins are tricky, and we know there's a lot more money in the US. Commercialization in the US is a lot more lucrative for European businesses, but like you said, at the end of the day, it comes down to that patient impact.
It does. I mean, we've been very lucky in the UK. I mean, we've had very good relationships with centrally, and so there's been a few key people, both clinically and from an administrative perspective in the NHS, who've really been champions of our technology and seeing the impact it can have. And so when we've been ramping up the adoption, we were able to find the resources in order to deliver it. But you're right, it can be really tough in the NHS to put in an innovative new technology. I mean, it's not one system. It's very bureaucratic and be very slow. But because of a few individuals, I think, plus a bit of favourable winds, we managed to get our technology in most of the UK, which has been fantastic.
Awesome. So what does the future look like for you guys? Is it additional disease states? Is it just expansion globally, or is it all of the above?
Yeah, I mean, we like to grow in every dimension, I guess. I certainly think there is opportunity to look at other indications. One of the things I think that we have made a decision that we are not is a sort of all things to all people platform. And, we've seen some of the challenges of trying to deliver that sort of approach, the App Store approach for medical AI image technology. I don't think has worked because as well as it might have done, because I think it's not just about, it's not like an app. You can't just have it and then expect to you have to work with people, partner with people to have an impact. I think there are other conditions we can look at. We don't have any sort of definite at the moment, but we are working in some R&D spaces looking at sort of broader indications. Some of them are tangential to what we're already doing, where we can add more value to patients. Commercial growth is clearly always a driver for any business. So more of the same, I think, looking to do in particularly in the US, but also in Europe and other territories globally. And then the other piece, which I think for me, just mainly because I'm ultimately responsible for it, is I think really exciting is as clinical medicine has adopted AI innovation, digital innovation to improve the way that care is delivered, we're seeing a parallel, maybe slightly delayed adoption in clinical trials and also in the sort of phase 4 go-to-market strategy in pharma. And I think we've had some really exciting partnerships with multiple big pharma companies, and I'm hoping that we see more and more of that, and actually in a more and more strategic way. So trying to create, we can create bespoke solutions for specific indications for clinical trials and try and unlock either broader indications for drugs or de-risk the clinical trials that people are doing to get more drugs for patients to ultimately benefit.
Yeah, I do love the focus on the software side and obviously the pharma side as well, and now the clinical trial side too. Obviously, as part of that pharma side, it's quite a unique application for it. I feel like a lot of the time it's hardware or software, and or maybe both, and you're focusing on maybe trying to take over the world. And you're absolutely right. I think you have to become an expert at one thing and a master at one thing first. And it sounds like you guys have done that. And then the lung piece is the natural progression because of similar progressions of the disease state. And then one step at a time, become the expert at one before moving into the others.
I think that's right. I think it's too easy to spread yourself too thin, yeah. And I think having focus is really important because we have clinical experts perhaps who might come in and support bits of the business, but actually for stroke and lung disease now, everyone in the business becomes an expert at it in their particular domain. When it comes to the implementation from a technical perspective, our technical team understand the clinical pathway. If we were to do a prostate tool or something, as they are, the team don't have that depth of knowledge, that experience.
Sure.
And so there's a whole load of stuff that can go that doesn't work. You don't extract their value. Whereas actually at the moment, we've really invested in what we do to do it as well as we can. And I think that, or I hope that quality, I guess, pays off in the end, that we can continue to add value and be meaningful rather than just a tick box.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, looking with your specific focus within the stroke space, obviously, I'm curious where you think the future of stroke treatment technology would be. Obviously, we're talking about, clinical AI, imaging AI, but there's a lot happening in the wider neurotech space in general, from stimulatory devices and so forth. What does the future look like for you?
Yeah, I think there are ongoing developments in the pharma space. That's definitely exciting. I guess it's sort of, you might think of it as old news, pharma drug stuff. They've always been developed and introduced, but actually, in combination with improved technology to better characterize patients, improve sort of phenotyping, to target treatments better, I think we will start to see new treatments unlocked in stroke. So I think that's one sort of area. The drug space, I think, you can't ignore. And I think technology is a real catalyst for getting new treatments into stroke care. But I think digital technology more broadly is clearly, a big opportunity in stroke, whether it's in the acute space, supporting sort of diagnostics, the clinical data capture, whether that's from sort of camera, images, speech recognition technology. There's all sorts of sort of data points that you can use technology to get in to help with diagnostic support. And of course, stroke is actually a long-term journey. So you then got, interventions. There are lots of devices you use to treat strokes, and I suppose they'll continue to innovate and develop. But then the other piece is, after you've had your stroke, the damage is done. You've got to help your brain recover. And so the rehabilitation space is very interesting. And, there's a lot of very accessible technologies like sort of virtual reality headsets, augmented reality, whatever it is. They are, I think, a really exciting tool to support the delivery of rehabilitation, of an assessment and evaluation, of patient progress. So I think the future is very bright. I think there's a lot of things that we can do, sort of all along the patient pathway, and then the other piece, of course, is the coordination of the whole patient pathway. So, and this is probably more of a system level innovation, but I think technology generally, and having improved understanding of data in healthcare systems, will allow for more efficient healthcare delivery. So, for example, resource allocation, thinking about use of your existing resources, data capture. All of this stuff is might seem a bit abstract, but actually, cumulatively, I think the opportunity to make healthcare systems more efficient is massive. And then if you make healthcare systems more efficient, you can then improve the patient experience and the consistency, I guess, of patient care.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's an exciting time, isn't it? I feel like we're on the precipice of a lot of technological change. And I think it's not just, pharma's a thing of the past. The technology is the future. It's obviously all going to be done in tandem. And we're seeing more and more technologies, like similar to you guys, working in tandem with pharmaceutical companies too. So it's a really, really exciting time. I think there's a lot of just modernization of clinical work, which is really, really the highlight of all.
I think so. And I think one of the things that I've been reflecting on over the last sort of year or two has been AI has been a real driver and enabler of our innovation. It's allowed us to handle large volumes of data and get something meaningful out of it in a hopefully consistent way. And we're seeing that in all walks of life. But I think in healthcare, as much as anywhere else, it's helped to a limit, but it reaches a ceiling in terms of what data you can get in and then what you can do with the data out the back end of it. So I think one of the other areas, or the two other areas that need to sort of co-develop, that data in piece, so which is really about sensing technology in whatever form that comes. It might be, plowing through patient records, electronic records, but it might be interpreting physiological data. It might be, looking at imaging data. Whatever it is, it's there's all this input data which needs capturing and structuring. Then you've got your AI algorithms, which I think are really flying at the moment, and then you've got your enabler of some treatment or intervention. And so I guess the robotic space is really exciting. I think we will start to see, if you can, it's all very well just to come up with an output that you give to a doctor or a nurse or whatever, and a clinician, just to do something with it, but actually then to be able to affect it in some more meaningful and complex way, I think is the other area of innovation that we're starting to see develop. So it might be your sensing technology helps inform your patient's need from a rehabilitation point of view. It all gets sort of processed onto AI, and then actually you have some sort of robotic device or some rehabilitation implementation tool that then enacts it. So I think there is the longer term sort of vision, I think, is exciting.
Yeah, the robotic space is often not spoken about as much as, I think brain foundational models and understanding the brain more, and how everything in the future is going to be about, like I said, sensing what's going on in your body, but your brain, like the aura ring of the brain being the potential next major device, whoever can crack the form factor. But then that is not just clinical or medical focused brain data. That is, everyday walk of life, maybe going to the gym data as well, and dietary data and so forth, and how it all interacts.
So that's interesting. Yeah, I think I completely agree. That's very much a sensing problem in terms of data ingestion. One of the things that we've been doing, which I think is really interesting, is in stroke, for example. When you have a stroke, it doesn't occur in isolation. It happens in somebody who's lived a life, and you don't know what sort of life they've lived when they come in, but actually you can get a fair measure from their brain scan. So we have measures of brain frailty we now generate, which think about, what sort of state was this brain in coming into their stroke. And actually that, I think, is really exciting. It's a very powerful modifier of outcomes. So people who have a aged brain, but perhaps a more modest chronological age, have worse outcomes, and there are other people who are much more sort of who are biologically younger, I guess, who do better. So I think there is a lot in that. I think better understanding individuals, the sort of concept of personalized medicine is definitely going to be enabled in a much more meaningful way, not just by AI, but that sensing technology. And you're right, it may be people's aura rings or whatever it is feed into their health record. But I think I think that's something we'll see more of.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I appreciate it, George. Thank you so much for your time. Absolutely fascinating and plenty to think about. It's a really interesting angle, actually. The medical records, brain data and aura ring and medical records in the future will most likely be a thing, right? But yeah, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. It's been great to chat to you again.
Thanks, Chay.
This podcast is brought to you by Carter Sciences, the headhunting practice that covers not only headhunting, but also fractional talent work for startups who need help but don't want to spend those big recruitment fees, wanting to work on a more hourly basis with companies, and also career coaching for neurotech professionals. The goal is to provide cost-effective solutions across all neurotech hiring needs.